I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to introduce you to our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus. It's an app you can get on your phone. You just tap it like this, boom, and it opens right up. The app is free, and that opens up access to literally hundreds and hundreds of courses, each of which has dozens of lectures. So that's thousands and thousands of lectures. And it's a great way to consume content when you're driving, cycling, hiking, walking, doing chores, vacuuming, weeding, whatever. I pretty much listen to lectures all the time when I'm alone. And it's a great way to access free knowledge. I mean, once you've paid here, the free trial you get through my site and $30 off for the annual plan, it comes out to about $10 a month. It's a great deal. So to get that, go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer, and you get $30 off and a free trial. Like, here's just recommended from me, based on what I've listened to in the past. The History of Secret Societies, I already heard that one. Understanding the Dark Side of Human Nature, heard that one already. Great Questions of Philosophy and Physics, I heard a couple of those lectures. The Federalist Papers, which I haven't listened to yet. Big Questions of Philosophy, heard that one. Law School for Everyone, haven't heard that one yet. Language and Mind, Going to the Devil, Your Deceptive Mind, I heard that one. Great Ideas of Philosophy. Here's an interesting one. The Skeptic's Guide to American History. That sounds appropriate for me. Anyway, you get the idea. It's a great product. Everybody's consuming content these days online because of COVID. So this is a great source for you. Again, it's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. You get $30 off for the annual plan, and a free trial comes out to $10 a month. Check it out. Thanks for listening. My guest today is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan is a Somalia-born women's rights activist, free speech advocate, and the New York Times bestselling author of Infidel, The Caged Virgin, Nomad, Heretic, and The Challenge of Dawa. Born in Mogadishu, Somalia, she grew up in Africa and the Middle East before seeking asylum in the Netherlands, where she went on to become a member of parliament. Today, she lives in the United States with her husband and 2 sons. A refugee herself, Hirsi Ali is not against immigration. As a child in Somalia, she suffered female genital mutilation. As a young girl in Saudi Arabia, she was made to feel acutely aware of her own vulnerability. Immigration, she argues, requires integration and assimilation. She wants Europeans to reform their broken system and for Americans to learn from European mistakes. If this doesn't happen, the calls to exclude new Muslim migrants from Western countries will only grow louder. Her new book about this is called Pray, and it is about this very subject. The subtitle is Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. She offers a trigger warning that upon reading this book, you should be triggered. So I will give you this trigger warning. If you listen to this conversation, you should be triggered. I mean, the problem is acute. The data is there. She has massive data in the book, as well as lots of anecdotes and history and science. And it's really an important book. And I hope you read it and pass it along. We talk about women's rights in third world Muslim countries versus EU countries, what's happened when these young men come to these European Union countries, the problem of inculcating Western values in young men that are immigrating. We talk about Germany's response to the civil rights violations in countries like Syria and Afghanistan, and why they opened the borders and what a disaster that turned out to be. And then we get into many of the solutions, deep, long-term solutions about Enlightenment values and how long it took to accommodate those or inculcate those here in the West, how long it's going to take to spread around the world. And that ultimately, we have to do this. And then we drill down into specific recommendations she has for immigration policy in the United States and in Europe. So with that, I give you Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, well, thanks for coming on. You know, I don't think we've ever formally met, although I did meet you briefly with other faculty at Occidental College. Must have been 15 years ago or so when you gave a talk there. And I'll never forget it because you were talking about violence in Islam, and there were two very earnest-looking women in the hijab sitting there very quietly the entire time waiting for the Q&A, and they just let into you about, you know, how unfair it was that you would overgeneralize because Islam is a religion of peace and so on and so on. And you gave the best mic drop answer, which was, then why do I have to travel with bodyguards? And it was like, boom.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I mean, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. I hope you don't have to do that still,
Yeah.
but that is troublesome.
I have to, unfortunately. And I feel like, you know, I've over time since you and I last met, made friends with ex-Muslims, agnostic Muslims, Muslim reformers. So that position, or it's just a religion of peace, I don't think that anyone is buying into that anymore.
Yeah.
I think ISIS killed that idea.
Yes, I think so. Well, let me formally introduce the book here. I didn't get a physical copy yet. Mail is so slow these days because of COVID, but I listened to the entire audio version, which you read very, very artfully. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, hold that up. Pray, Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. It's a very moving book. I have to say, I love your trigger warning, which is to say you should be triggered by this book. And if you're not, you know, you're not thinking clearly on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start with.
And then now we are. I don't know. I really wanted to do the tech stuff first because you sent us a lot of. You know, this is how I want things done.
Oh no, you look good. We're rolling here. We can go ahead and start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah. No, that's good. Let's start it with the bigger picture. You know, Steve Pinker and I and Matt Ridley and a few others have tracked moral progress and human progress over the centuries. But after reading your book, it seems like that nice moral arc of the moral universe bending ever upward took a bit of a dip in 2015 and has been on the decline here. How do you see, like, because you're an Enlightenment thinker, how do you see the big picture over the centuries? Is this just a temporary blip for a few years? Is this a serious long-term trend downward? Or you know, how do you put it into context?
I would say it all depends on the choices that the West makes, right? You know, as you know, I'm a huge admirer of Steve Pinker, and so is my husband, Matt Ridley. And the proposition that things have been getting better for humanity in general is true. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Just look at the technology we enjoy, the wealth, the health. There are still places that are Hobbesian, where you know, people live in a state of nature and life is short and nasty and brutal and all of that. That's still true. But we've made so much progress. And as a female, as a woman, I think, God, I'm so grateful that I wasn't born in the 15th century or the 16th or the 17th or the 18th. But those Enlightenment principles that have provided us with so much progress, they need to be maintained, to be nourished. Each and every generation has to be taught afresh that these are things that it doesn't come naturally to human beings. We fight for them. People die for them. People are put on the stake for them. And every time, regardless of how educated and liberated and wealthy and so on we come up with really bad ideas, terrible ideas. And each and every time there is a segment of humanity that wants to shut down free inquiry, science, objective truth, and fellow, human beings being fellow human beings instead of dividing us into tribes and factions and groups and so on. And so the answer, the question that you asked is a very, very important question. I think it all depends on what the West and Western civilization is willing to fight for.
Yeah, certainly this idea of progress is not Marxian in nature, in which there's some kind of Hegelian driving force or inevitable progress or anything like that. We just have to make it happen, and if we don't, then it doesn't happen. So there's nothing magical about it.
Then it doesn't happen. Right. It doesn't happen. And if we have to agree on what it is, what the priorities are. I mean, there's so much to disagree on. I like disagreement. I think it's good to have disagreements because it gives you a chance to see things from different perspectives. But what I'm against is the idea, the notion, whether it's religious, it's a religious movement, a quasi-religious or a secular movement, but any one group that demands that your free conscience, your thoughts, your ideas, your hypotheses are blasphemous to them, and that therefore you must be shut up, you must be jailed for that, you must be fired for that, you must be cancelled for that. That, I think, is wrong, and it's something that anybody who really understands what true freedom is should just simply, it doesn't matter whether we agree or not, but we should really fight that.
Yeah.
Tooth and nail.
Yeah, and you have specific policy recommendations at the end of your book. But before we get into those and sticking with the bigger theme, I asked Steve, what would you like to ask Ayaan Pinker? So he said, and this is in the context also, I was thinking about Bernard Lewis's great book, What Went Wrong? So Steve asks, you might ask whether there is hope for an Islamic Enlightenment, particularly driven by younger generational cohorts. Faisal al-Murtar's Ideas Beyond Borders, I'm on their board, is an example. In Enlightenment now, I listed many others. What went wrong? Couldn't Islam still have an Enlightenment like the West did centuries ago?
Yeah, so I think I want to thank Stephen for asking that, but thank him even more for being on Faisal al-Murtar's organization, which is an organization that is trying to do precisely what I've been fighting for and what Steve wants, which is to bring the ideas, and these are very complex ideas, but the ideas of the Enlightenment to 1/5 of humanity. And I'm very optimistic about Muslim individuals. The reason why I say that is because I've met people like Faisal and others who are on their own and following their own path to trying to figure out what is life all about, what is objective truth, what is right, what is wrong, what is morality. That on their own, they have come, just like me, found their path to some of these Enlightenment thinkers. Now, what can we do? I think, aside from joining boards, which I really think is a good thing, I know one of the projects that Faisal was working on, and I came up with that idea myself a few years prior, was to have the Enlightenment thinkers translated into Arabic, into Farsi, into all the languages that are spoken in Muslim majority countries, and put all that on the internet for free. Make it available and accessible to anyone and everyone who can engage with it. And that would be one concrete, practical thing to do.
Yeah. That
would help. I remember reading Hayek. I remember thinking, okay, because I admired big government. I was very skeptical of free markets and capitalism until I read Hayek, and then I thought, wow, I get it. I remember feeling mentally challenged by Milton Friedman. I'm not good with numbers, I'm not good in economics, but the philosophical point he makes about freedom, I thought that was fascinating. But that also goes all the way back to the stories and the biographies of people like Copernicus that I identified with, or Spinoza, people who were persecuted for thinking out aloud. Even Martin Luther, Calvin, even those individuals, I know they were hugely religious. And we look back on that time and think, we are incredibly enlightened. But the questions they were asking, the societies that they were challenging. The powers that be that they were, saying it just doesn't work like that anymore. We get you. We can see right through you, and then having to be confronted with the life or death predicament, where if you shut up, if you stay silent, you can live longer, but not in freedom, not in dignity, not with your integrity intact, not with your conscience. So I think bringing that to Muslim individuals in Muslim majority countries, Muslim individuals as minorities in Western society, I think it's a great thing to do.
Yeah. There you're talking, though, about kind of bottom-up activity in which no one's forcing anybody to do anything. You're just making the materials available, kind of an intellectual history approach, which I think does work. I don't know if it's enough. You still need, as you outline in your last chapter, sometimes laws have to be changed. And there you get to this kind of tough issue of to what extent do we go in there, we Western countries, to help people? I mean, we have a moral obligation to help people that can't help themselves. Okay. But on the other hand, if you just send troops in, why is that any of our business to nose around in some other country's business? That ever since the First World War, there's been this idea of, countries have autonomy and we can't just muck around and tell them what to do. I remember reading George W. Bush mentioned Nathan Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy, as, kind of driving his foreign policy. So I read that book. And, he makes the case that the arguments against bringing democracy to third world countries, like in Africa, for example, are kind of racist. The arguments that they're not ready for it, they're not smart enough, they're not educated enough or whatever. And then he kind of knocks those down and say, well, that's kind of bigoted and racist to say that. This isn't rocket science. I mean, it's just democracy. And I thought, yeah, that's right. But then we saw what happened, when we went into Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, here's democracy. And it's like, it didn't work so well not because they're not smart enough, but because of these tribal divisions and so on. So I remain very conflicted about to what extent we have a moral obligation to go in there and help people, and that we know democracy works and regulated free markets work and so on. But to what extent can you make that happen versus help it happen if they want it?
I think if you frame it as a moral obligation, you're going to get a lot of Americans and a lot of people in Western society who are going to say, let's just mind our own business and leave the rest of the world to mind their own business. If you frame it as self-interest, rightly understood, I think you'll get a different response. Why? Because the world is interconnected. We are globalized and we are globalizing. We've always been globalized, but now because of these incredibly cheap ways of getting from A to B, you have people coming from, and this is the theme of my book, large swathes of people born in Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, China, it really all over the world. People seeking freedom will go to great lengths to come to America, for example, or to come to Europe. But as Europeans and as Americans, we also engage with the rest of the world through trade, through politics, through alliances, and so on. And so given that interconnectedness, if you frame it as self-interest, rightly understood, then the way I see it is pushing the ideas and the values of the Enlightenment is not just a moral obligation. You're not doing other people a favor. You want to tilt the world towards some of the moral insights that have made Western civilization so incredibly powerful and progressive. And I don't mean progressive in the woke sense.
Yes.
I mean progressive in moved forward through. So I think if you frame it that way, then that can shape our foreign policy and our diplomacy, but also the way we look at ourselves. I don't like virtue signaling. I don't like preaching, going to people and saying, come and to my way of thinking and my way of living because it's better than yours. I don't think that's how you're going to get anywhere. But for people to see, the people are voting with their feet. People are coming from Latin America in large numbers. They're coming from Africa in large numbers. They're coming from Asia in large numbers. I think it is that, therefore, I would make a compelling case to say, this is the reason why you're coming. Here's why our culture is superior to yours. Not as human beings. I'm not talking about white supremacy or any of those types of, tribal, we are better than you are. But I mean, look at the COVID-19 pandemic and how different countries are handling it. I know that there's a lot of criticism on the domestic level within America and within the various Western countries, but each and every leader and each and every Congress and Parliament is trying to figure out how can we fight this pandemic on the one hand, keep the economy going, and maintain the freedoms that we have. These are questions, moral questions that I think and want. And how is it that we got here? Why did we get here?
Yeah. Well, in a way, people voting with their feet of where they want to go to from their homelands, which they are apparently unhappy with, is a kind of data collection about what systems work, because this is what people want. And so in a way, you could use kind of a comparative method of social science or historical science to say, well, this is what happened, so we can infer internal motives. The problem, as you outline in Prey, is that people bring with them their values from their home countries, and they don't always integrate. So let's just get right into the teeth of your book. It's data driven, which I love, of course, and if there's always been immigrants from these countries into the European Union, the problem spiked around 2015, where you have, let's say, from Afghanistan. I'm just reading from your table 1 here. Illegal entrance into the EU, 2009 to 2018. It's like 14,000, 25,000, 22,000, 13,000, 9,000, 22,000 to 2014. And then at 2015, 267,000, and then 54,000, and then 7,000, 12,000, total 450,000. So you have this huge spike, and this is the case from Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Syria. Particularly Syria, unbelievable, almost 600,000. Spike in 2015 from 78,000 in 2014. So here, it seems like you shift from a quantitative difference from year to year to a qualitative difference when the number just goes up almost an order of magnitude. And therein, I think, is your point, lies the problem.
Yeah.
Just the sheer numbers and then what they bring with them.
Yeah, so number one, there's the sheer numbers, which I think a lot of people in Europe, when they were confronted with the sheer numbers, were just happy to talk about nothing else other than numbers. So they just wanted to talk about quantities, about, how do we deal with this? And that's always very immediate. It's the emergency, the most urgent thing that you need to do, housing, medical, that sort of thing. And there was a huge reluctance, probably still so in some countries, to talk about the qualitative. And the qualitative, it goes back to when we had immigrants coming in as guest workers as far back as the 1960s. And their children having a very hard time assimilating into some of these European societies. And one feature of that difficulty or value clash, whatever you want to call in terms of assimilation, was the treatment of women, girls and women. So men who came from Muslim majority countries, when they got the opportunity to bring their families over, and they started to have daughters growing up in Holland, France, the UK, you name it, those girls were treated differently by their own families. Many of them denied freedom of movement. They were forced into marriages. They were subjected to female genital mutilation. Sometimes they were kidnapped and taken back to the country of origin and married off to someone they had never met before. Other times they were still treated as commodity because male members of the extended family would be brought in to marry the girls that were in, because having, citizenship in any European country is seen as it's a thing of value because of the welfare, and let's just put it, the material welfare. And so these European governments and elites and societies, they were confronted with these problems. They discussed and debated them. We're still talking about quality here. And, people on the center left, people on the center right would say, well, we recognize that this is a problem, but it's their culture, it's their customs. They were having conversations about how some of these countries behaved during the Second World War, how they had betrayed their Jewish communities. They were having conversations about colonialism, no longer about the positive aspects of colonialism, which I believe were there, but they were now having conversations and deep regrets about the negative aspects of colonialism. So as part of, that kind of national identity or European identity, the default position was, let them just be, leave them, let them have their customs, even if that meant sacrificing the rights of girls and women who were just as vulnerable, if not more. Now, fast forward with the large numbers coming in, now we're going to get into quantity. We are seeing an increment of first generation immigrants who were already there, second generation, and then the new wave. And all of that then spills over into the public space, and that starts to hurt women, not just immigrant women, not just Muslim women, but all women. And if you read the book, you'll see that some of the girls were attacked as young as 11 years old. But there are women in their 70s, 80s who also get attacked. So when you come from a culture where women are divided into two categories, only the good who are supposedly modest and virtuous, and the bad who are immodest and not virtuous, and you have all of these prejudices against them, these young men, just because they crossed the Mediterranean, doesn't mean that they suddenly will adopt the culture of Europe of equality between men and women and dignity for women and living. No, these young men are they're stunned. They see women on the streets uncovered at all hours of the day and night, and they really don't, they're confused as much as the host society is confused about their culture and their customs and what you can get away with as a man. So I think this confrontation between the West and the East is taking place on so many different levels, but the most dramatic one of those is the relationship between men and women.
Yeah, maybe this is a good time to bring up The Clash of Civilizations that was published, I think, in 1996, so 25 years ago. You hint in the book that you think this is a viable thesis, even though it has been critiqued. But after reading your book, I thought, yeah, okay, maybe this is how this is played out in this treatment of women in Western cultures from non-Western men who come there.
So Samuel Huntington, yes, he first wrote that essay in Foreign Affairs magazine, The Clash of Civilizations, and he had a question mark at the end of that.
Oh, right.
Article.
That's right.
And then later on, he published the book. Yeah. Yes, there was a lot of criticism. I would say one of the things I regret in my life is never having met Samuel Huntington in person. But I lived in Cambridge. I've seen some of the places where he had been and taught, and a lot of the criticism to me sounded like pure envy. He was. There were some ways in which I think Professor Huntington was wrong, or maybe short-sighted, or maybe didn't see things develop. He had written a subsequent book on American culture and the place of Hispanics in America. And I think in that sense, he probably didn't foresee what he thought he foresaw. But when it comes to the clash of civilizations, he was spot on. And that is going to be a classic. It is a classic, and it's going to be a classic. 100 years, 200, 300 years from now, we will be reading that book as human beings and looking back and saying, yeah, he had more to teach us than some of his contemporaries who didn't get as much criticism as he did. In fact, here, I would say, is the case to be made for free inquiry, is that you read a piece of work and it upsets you and it unsettles you, and you get so excited about it, positively or negatively. And then you have all this feedback and just the sheer volume of criticism that Professor Huntington had tells me the importance of that work.
Interesting.
The significance of that work.
That's a nice endorsement. I'll have to go back and re-listen to that book. So in your book, Prey, the clash of civilizations is the treatment of women. That is to say, in the West, women should be treated equally under the law, equal rights, and so on. And so the problem is men from non-Western countries are immigrating to the EU and bringing with them values that treat women as second-class citizens, or as property, or as not humans to be respected in the same way that you'd respect men, let's say. And this plays out with sexual assault and rape and violence and to catcalling or whatever. You do hint at the beginning the difficulty of getting data on this. It seems to me, from looking at your book, the data is pretty clear. We have a problem, but just take a minute to explain how difficult it is, because maybe it's underreported because women don't want to come forward, as in the United States has been the case after a rape or a sexual assault, or maybe the reporting authorities don't want to play up how big a problem it is for political correctness reasons, or for their own political reasons, for getting reelected or whatever. You don't want to, have your opponent say, things got really bad under his leadership, so you should dump him. So they don't play it up. And what other factors are there on that?
So it's all of that. It is obviously underreported. Women who become victims of sexual assault, sexual harassment, rape, they're not very keen to go to the authorities to report. And I would say maybe they would be just a little bit keener if they thought that the case would go somewhere, that it served, that it would be a warning, that they would be doing society good, because by reporting their own case, they would be able to save other girls and other women from getting themselves into the same problems, or warning the authorities to say these things happen and that they have to take action. So the underreporting is a very, very serious issue. And when I say serious issue, I know from the immigrant women who come from cultures of honor and shame that to report your own rape is to get yourself into even more trouble, because your own family, who are supposed to protect you, are going to say, well, what the hell were you doing where you got raped? So it's your fault. Now, I thought emancipated, strong women living in Scandinavia and other parts of Northern Europe, Germany, Holland, even countries like France, where all the time we're told how strong and sophisticated French women are, that it would be a piece of cake for them to go out and say, this is what happened and it should stop happening. But again, they were telling a story. And the common thread here in the story is that you go to all the trouble of reporting, you go through the trauma, and nothing much happens. So the deterrence mechanisms, the punishment of the perpetrators, the tracing and tracking of the perpetrators, all of these things are at fault. Now, I understand, I've been around long enough in Europe to know that because they thought that these problems such as gang rapes and stuff like that, that they had left that behind them, that it's something that belonged in the past. They had never set up structures like that. So once in a while, a European country will say, why don't we just see, we're seeing a spike in reports. Why don't we go and pay this or that commission, this or that organization to get real data? They would get the real data. They would find that immigrant men from Muslim majority countries were victimizing not only their own women, but also were responsible for the spike in rapes, harassments, anything that makes a woman feel unsafe in the public space. They'd have a discussion about it, and then they'd throw it right under the carpet. Because, and here would the reasons that I was given, that would empower right-wing parties, extreme right-wing parties, populist parties. It would damage the reputation of, or they would not get votes themselves. Because as you know, in several of these European larger cities, the populations, the demographics have changed. So if you are a center-left party, like the Labour Party in the Netherlands, the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, or any of the social democratic parties in various other countries, you really do depend on the immigrant vote. And most of those immigrants come from Muslim majority countries, or their parents came from Muslim majority countries. So for that selfish and very narrow interest, the rights of women would be thrown under the bus. It didn't, you'd have to ask them, what is then the plus? What is the value for a politician to pursue bringing perpetrators from immigrant communities to justice and deporting them if he was going to end up losing votes, or if she was going to end up losing? So it's not just his. There are also women politicians who make the same calculation. And it's cynical, but that's what I have seen. And it's wrong.
Yeah, my wife Jennifer's from Cologne, Germany. And so when that happened on New Year's Eve 2015, when you write about this, so we heard a lot about that from her friends and colleagues and whatnot. And she knows people that were, groped and so on. But one thread that also we noted was that, the history of Germany, and given their attitudes toward Jews and how they over-stereotype, Jews do this, Jews do that. So then one thread was, well, we shouldn't overgeneralize about this is what Muslim men do because, look at our past. So I think there was a push to kind of, at least the part of some people, to just keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, which is absolutely wrong. So they let down the Jews in the 1920s and 30s and farther back, but they fed them to Hitler's killing machine. And they regret it, and they're embarrassed about it, and they feel ashamed about it. And so then 50, 60, 70 years later, to fix that, they're feeding women,
right?
All women in this case, past immigrant women, and now all women, to perpetrators of sexual assaults and rapes and gropings, making women unsafe in the public space. Is that how you fix the wrongs of the past?
Right. No, obviously not. Yeah. Yeah, but this is some of the pushback you've gotten in your career is you're generalizing about a particular religion, and we in the West, we don't want to do that anymore because we used to do that and that led to bad things.
Well, yeah. And so you get, you have shallow, superficial pushback. That's not a real pushback. A real pushback would be for them to actually go and engage in the same exercise that I did and see, where am I mistaken? Am I exaggerating? Is the problem too small? If they come to the same conclusion that we do have a problem, Muslim majority countries in the world treat women differently.
Yeah.
That's an empirical fact.
Yeah.
It's not a generalization of, I'm just pulling that out of my
Yeah.
hat.
Yeah.
And when young men, I'm seeing a lot of young men come. So sometimes it's like over 60% of arrivals are men all by themselves with no family. And many of them are also very young. They're under 30, they're under 25. Um, Now, again, it's a human fact and an empirical human fact that where you have a youth bulge, especially, a large cohort of young men who have nothing to do, you have a great deal of violence and misconduct. And so I'm not saying this is specific to Islam or Muslims or any one subset of humanity. This is a general, universal.
Yeah.
But the reason why I want to talk about cultures is because in Western civilization, we got to a place where we thought that we had reasonably tamed those male forces or that particular, I don't know, concentration of testosterone. Uh, and in other cultures, they've tried to deal with it in other ways. I come from Somalia. We send men into war. We send them into war because you get them away from women, you get them away from families. They have something to do, and that's just how they think that
Yeah.
that's how to deal with that kind of with that kind of energy. Let's
Right.
just put it that way. We live
Right.
in a politically correct era. And so what I have a hard time understanding is why in different places in Europe, even in America, we're making it difficult for ourselves to acknowledge this, universal human issue, and why we're not just making an effort to maybe develop programs, but assimilate these young men so that they come to respect women's rights. I'm disappointed in feminists
Yeah.
because they seem to have gone woke instead of doing, the core of the feminist mission, especially those who are organized, is to say, we're here to protect the rights of women.
Right.
And now there are very few people doing, very few organizations doing that, and that's disappointing.
Yes. Yeah. So let's drill down to the problem at hand here. I was thinking about this the other day, listening to your book. I was at a playground with my 4.5-year-old son, and at the little grassy park next door, there was a group of like 20 or 30 women doing yoga, outdoor yoga, because, California, we're shut down, as you know, and so on. Anyway, so I got to thinking, what are the chances that if some good-looking guy walked by, these group of women would start ogling him and whistling at him and making comments? Like zero chance. There'd be no chance of that ever happening. So it's obvious what the problem is. It's men. As Steve Pinker likes to say, the number one predictor of violence is maleness. As you go down the list, that's the top one.
Maleness. Yeah, it is maleness. But there are cultures that have actually been successful into turning that male energy into what we used to call chivalry, where actually, if you were to do that in front of a group, if you were a man and you were to behave badly towards a woman, a chivalrous man would come and let you know that you can't do that. Mm-hmm. You'd be in big trouble for that. And we established institutions and norms, some of them written, some of them unwritten. And now we seem to be willing to say goodbye to all of that.
Yeah.
And I think there is a case to be made that immigrant men from Muslim majority countries who come to Europe, they could be taught chivalry because they have that strong maleness about them, and they could be taught to be protective and respectful, and try to be loving and endearing, show them a different side of themselves. But because we hamstrung ourselves by saying, well, we can't, this is our culture, this is European or Western, we can't impose that on them, that would be racist. Mm-hmm. That would be white supremacy. That, I think, is a huge mistake. We're making a very, very big mistake in doing that, because there is actually a risk that men that we thought, European men, American men, who were made to see that they had to control their maleness, might decide to devolve. Why not?
Right.
If he's getting away with it, why am I getting away with it?
Right. Right.
Why am I going 15 years to if he's only going to do 2 weeks of community service?
Right.
Those questions are going around on the internet.
Yeah.
It's not good for women.
Right. And it's not good for men. And when you say, when you say we, are moving in this direction, well, half the West is conservative. If you divide even European political parties, they roughly cluster left or right. And so you get, at least half the people, but maybe that half that agrees with what you just said wants to generally keep their mouth shut and their heads down out of fear of being canceled or, thought to be racist or bigoted. And so just better not to say anything.
And that's a self-imposed problem. So I remember, the years I spent talking about radical Islam, that was an external factor. It was an ideology coming from the outside in and trying to claim, people's hearts and minds and spaces and so on. But now here we have our own homegrown ideology, postmodernism, and all the different ways in which it manifests itself, coming up with such nonsense as intersectionality, calling this a critical race theory, critical justice theory, so on and so forth. But we've developed our own totalitarian ideology. Please excuse me.
Double bless you.
Excuse me. It's not. Thank you.
For what that's worth from an atheist.
We've now developed our... Yeah, God bless you. So in any case, I just wanted to say we have now developed our own ideology. Homemade, homegrown, totalitarian. They say post-modern. Sometimes I think perhaps hyper-modern, given the use of social, that whole social media infrastructure. And then in some ways even primitive, because it becomes tribal. It becomes a sense where you only listen to people who agree with you, you engage only with people who agree with you, and you treat everyone else with extreme hostility. Now, I come from a clan society. I was a little girl, 7, 8, 9 years old, and I was taught she's of a different clan.
Mm.
So we used to have our hair braided and fill them with thorns and go as a group, from my clan, and we pick a fight from kids with the other clan. And we had only one goal, and that was to destroy them.
Right.
And the more blood you saw, even as a kid, better. So you went home with a trophy. You say, some kids would come and say, I bit someone else's ear off. And the parents, the extended family would applaud. Now, I'm not saying that we were barbaric. I'm just saying that it was in many ways, it was us or them.
Yeah.
And now here in America, we're looking at liberals versus conservatives, Republicans versus Democrats, and we seem to be making the exact same mistake, regardless of all we make in education, in human rights, in humanity, in science. It's depressing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I can't, you watch Fox News or you listen to conservative talk radio and they just say the left, the left, the left, the left, as if anybody 1 millimeter to the left of dead center is Antifa. And then on the other side, you hear, pretty much anyone who's 1 millimeter to the right of dead center is the Proud Boys or a neo-Nazi. And it's just not helpful at all.
And QAnon.
Yeah, QAnon. Yeah, crazy
no,
QAnon.
It's not, yeah. Yeah. And for me and my husband, our family, we have friends both on the right and on the left. And I can tell you that on the left, they really are very much worried. I'm talking about sane, center-left, really good people, really, really concerned about this whole woke nonsense, this cancel culture. Everyone thought it was nonsense, and it's not nonsense anymore. People on the right center right again, super sane, super decent, worry about some of these, QAnon conspiracy theories, people refusing to take vaccines if the vaccine were available to everyone.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So I think it's probably time to go back to the center, if at all possible.
Classical liberalism. I think that's my new label now. It has some gravitas to it, and it was kind of what the founding fathers believed, and it was more unifying perhaps than it is now. Anyway, back to the difference between men and women. So that joke about women need a reason to have sex, men need a place. Or that line from Woody Allen's movie Annie Hall, where Diane Keaton's character says, sex without love is a meaningless activity, and Woody says, yeah, but as meaningless activities go, it's one of the best. So you get these men coming in, and they haven't inculcated the Western values. They just grew up in a completely different culture. Maybe it's not really their fault. And they just don't know any better. So let's just think about how you tame that inner beast. What are the things that we've done in the West over the centuries that have kind of kept in check those male urges that we could possibly teach or inculcate into, or whatever, as you talk about integration or assimilation of people that didn't grow up with that.
I think what we've done in the West over centuries, it's not over years, it's over centuries, is that an effort was made to appeal to the inner goodness of the man, of males, those urges. If you could control them, you were awarded with, superiority status. You were a gentleman. There's a whole volume of literature about manners, good manners, and what chivalry is, and so on. And the same was done to women. Now, did we sometimes, even in the West, go to such extremes as, burning witches? I think about how women were treated that had children out of wedlock, and the misery under which the children born out of wedlock lived. And all of these human rights violations, well documented, all very much Western. These are things that happen in Britain and in France and in America and everywhere. But we evolved and evolved and evolved. And I think we came to a place when I came to the Netherlands in 1992, and I find myself in a society that is at the apex of reason. Women are safe in the public space, at least. We had issues with domestic violence, up and down social classes. There were still men misbehaving themselves, but the majority of society had come to a place where, there were contraceptives. They would say things along the lines of, these debates about abortion, it's only the Americans who have them because they're so far behind. But here, every male and every female, they know what they can do and what they can't do. When it comes to drugs, they know what they can do, they know what they can't do. So there was, I think, a time, very brief, let's just call it maybe an interbellum of sorts, where at least in Northern Europe, maybe parts of America, there was a sense that reason had prevailed. And I remember sitting in on conversations not about, do people have enough to eat? Is there enough safety? That used to be sort of all. That's where I came from. But they were having conversations about how much longer do we have to live? How can we eradicate Alzheimer's, the different forms of cancer, dementia? So we were moving, and you can actually shut yourself off from the rest of the world and just focus on these issues of how do I get to be 150? and maintain the kind of quality of life I had when I was in my 60s. I know people who do that.
Yeah, me too.
Right. And so science was then viewed from that perspective. Science wasn't viewed from how do we deal with male urges and collective male violence and what it does to women and families and society. Those conversations seem to have ended. You know, it's stuff that happens to other people in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. It doesn't happen to us.
Yeah.
But now I think we just simply can't run away from it. You know, the pandemic has made everything come back into focus. Our relationship with China. I think right now I'm worried more about that than I'm worried about the Middle East.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like that. Move back and
Yeah, I mentioned the women at your talk at Occidental wearing the hijab, and you know, the covering up and that sort of thing. Most of my atheist humanist friends are critical of that. As you know, our mutual friend Sam Harris calls it, you know, putting women in bags and so on. But what if it's a form of modesty? In as much as, say, conservatives tend to say, well, you know, it's women covering up, that's a good thing. You know how men are. And maybe a little modesty and some chastity is not a bad idea, you know, given, you know, human nature. And so I'll give you an example. Heather McDonald was on the show, and Heather's a longtime friend. And, you know, she makes the case that there was a shift in the sort of 60s and 70s about sexual mores, where before that it was understood that the default position on the part of the woman to the man was, we're not having sex tonight. That's it. And the guy understood, yeah, okay, we're not having sex, but at least I could try to seduce her or whatever, be charming. But they probably were not going to have sex. So her concern is that the default setting has shifted now. That men now think, well, we're going to have sex. And the women, if they don't want to have sex, they have to talk him out of it. And this is hard to do if you're at a frat party and everybody's been drinking and so on and so forth. And so anyway, I was just thinking about that with, you know, this Islamic, you know, clothing norms and so on, that kind of modesty. Maybe there's something to that, or maybe there's some connection there to conservative values. How do you think about that?
So I think I'll talk about what you know, Sam said, and then Heather. And Sam is my friend, Heather's my friend. We've had several conversations, agreements, disagreements. Now, I think I will say to Sam, you know, if you're a guy and you look at women who are covered from head to toe, and you pose the question, why is that woman covered from head to toe? And you're Sam Harris. And you're told, well, she's covered from head to toe because you could pounce on her. I just want you to imagine how offended he would be.
Yeah, of course.
Right? And Michael, yourself, or any other, you know, man who thinks of himself as, I'm not an animal. I'm actually a decent, cultured human being, love women and are protective of them, and they don't need to cover themselves up because I might have that kind of animal urge that I can't control, and I'll just pounce on her. So from Sam's perspective, I would want more and more men, most men, if not all men, to be just like him. Learn how to control your urges and be offended if you are told, we're going to cover up because we don't know what you might do. From Heather's perspective, again, incredibly challenging because I totally subscribe. And again, we've just talked about the man's position. You could be drunk and helpless and vulnerable, and a man would still not take advantage of you. And I will say to you, that is Sam Harris, and perhaps all males that Sam Harris knows, is they would never do that because it's been inculcated into them. It's been drilled into them, never ever to take advantage of a vulnerable female. Consent has to be consent. Then you go to Heather, and Heather says, I say, stop. If I don't want to have sex tonight, then I'm not going to have. I'm going to leave, whatever, and it's going to happen that way. The empirical issue with both sides is for young women and young men, say in colleges, high school, etc., it's a very tall order to get to these perfect places. These are aspirational places. We need to push them all up to get there. But if we expose them to one another in environments where one or the other, one lacks the control and the other drinks, seduces, and provides signals that say, I'm ready to have sex, and then pulls away at the last minute, we are going to have problems. And we're going to have huge problems, because then so we live in a, I want to go back to Steve Pinker about sort of Enlightenment societies that we have established, where we say evidence. You have to have, if you accuse someone of rape, you have to have evidence. And that evidence will go through that process of, the prosecutor, the defender. You really have to make the case. And it's very, very difficult, I would say, for any jury or any set of judges anywhere to decide on what happened at 3 a.m. after both parties have been drinking in some college dorm. And there, I think I'm putting myself in big trouble, because I'm supposed to be an absolutist and say, well, it shouldn't have happened. I wish it didn't. I wish we had all our young men on the Sam Harris level of civilization. I wish we had all our young women on the civilization level of Heather, but we don't. And sometimes, and here's where I think classical liberalism works for me, is that you don't only work with the world as it should be, you also have to work with the world as it is. And it's incremental. We want to get there step by step. I hope we will get there. I hope we can agree to get there. But it makes no sense whatsoever to, to assume these absolutist positions of morality, to virtue signal. A lot of virtue signaling, for instance, on the feminist side comes from women over the age of 50 or 60 who are not worrying about having abortions. They're not worried about getting raped in a college dorm. And so they can just push these things to look good and make themselves feel and sound good. But they're not the ones in those situations. So if I had a daughter now, I would say, please, if a man says, come to my hotel room at 10 p.m., don't go. If you find yourself at 3 a.m. in the morning drinking, you have to bear some responsibility for that behavior. Maybe you won't do it next time. I know that sort of advice is frowned upon, looked down upon, but you have to deal with the world as it is, not as you want it to be.
Yeah. Well, the Me Too movement has certainly exposed the fact that a lot of men didn't seem to get the memo back in the 90s and 2000s, when we all went through those training programs at corporations and universities, just to remind you, as a professor, don't sleep with the students, like, used to happen all the time, right? All those norms changed, and yet the Me Too movement kind of exposed the fact that particularly men in power. So I'm just curious how you think about this. That is to say, is sexual assault and rape about power? Is it about sex? Some blend in between. Heather makes this point, like almost half jokingly, that kind of progressive position that rape is nothing but about power. That when these young men in college frat parties are getting hammered and want to get into the pants of some woman, they're not thinking about the patriarchy and power. They're just thinking about sex. And yet other men, like, say, Harvey Weinstein, in a position of power, But maybe he's just using the power for sex. Anyway, I'm just kind of free associating here just to get your thoughts on that.
I think the Me Too movement started something, lifted the lid up on something that was bad and wrong. And I was fully on board with the initial phases where, yes, men in powerful positions were taking advantage of women in vulnerable positions. And they were using those positions to have sex with them, sometimes rape them, sometimes emotionally and sexually blackmail them. And it was good that that was exposed. It was uplifting for society. I thought it was, yet an extra rung on the ladder of evolution to something bigger and better. And then it became politicized. And the disappointing thing was, Me Too was now no longer just about giving women a voice who needed a voice, but it was taking those stories and hijacking them for political ends. I don't like what happened to Brett Kavanaugh. That made me so upset. I have to say to you that I've decided I'm not going to have anything to do with the Democratic Party after that, because it was so in your face hijacking of that particular issue to get an individual I had never heard of before, never met, never seen, didn't know. And I thought, if you want to vet a judge for the Supreme Court, subject him or her to the highest levels of vetting, please go ahead and do that. But to accuse him and of gang rape, of the things that were going on then, I thought that's not good for women. It's not good for men. It's actually not good for a free society that prides itself on the rule of law.
Yeah.
And it has intellectually actually scarred me, because I think of it as, wow, I thought these people are just really just as nasty as some of the politicians that we're exposed to in Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about this with the concept of belief. To what extent, say, do powerful Republicans really believe the QAnon conspiracy craziness? Probably not. Maybe they virtue signal in a way, I'm a good Republican tribal member. I'm going to sign off on the stolen election thing, even though it doesn't seem like that's really the case. And I was thinking about that with Heather McDonald's analysis of that study, that two campus study in one semester that said, 1 out of 5 or maybe even 1 out of 4 women would be sexually assaulted in their 4 years at a college campus. And of course, the Obama administration signed off on that, including Biden. And Heather makes the point that if people really believe that, would you send your daughter to an American college or university where there was a 20 to 25% chance she'd be sexually assaulted or raped? No. If you really believed it, there's no way you would do that. So I don't think anybody really believed that statistic. I think it was more like yeah, okay, there's a problem. We should address the problem.
Okay, so to Heather, I agree with Heather on that. I think that American universities, not all of them, but most of them are the safest places to be. I did not go to an American university. I went to a Dutch university, and I remember that period as part of the happiest times of my life. There were young men, obviously, from 18 to 23, 24, 25, because you have free education
Yeah.
there until you're 27. And I remember stories of girls thinking that a young man perhaps was too far, but I don't recall any incidents of feeling unsafe, except from immigrant men when I was going from the train station to my house on my bicycle. So I'm with Heather on that. I mean, I think all the young women I know would say, I would love to be admitted into Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, all of those places. And I think it's a good thing to have the conversation about How can we make these places appealing and safe and welcome for women? But as Camille Paglia, I hope I'm pronouncing her name
That's right.
correct,
Yeah.
as she points out, Camille Paglia, she points it out over and over again. We still are actually animals, and so even though we think of ourselves as the most civilized species of animals, we still are animals, and it would be prudent if young females took responsibility for some of the choices that they make. You can't. Some of what is now being called feminism is taking agency away from young women and women in general and putting it all on the male. And I think that formula is not going to work. I think what's going to work, common sense, is that you put a lot of responsibility on the young man, enhance and encourage what is good in him. That is the story of chivalry, of honor, of kindness, of manners, all that stuff. But you also have to put some responsibility and agency on the young woman, on the female, that she has to say, you know what, this is now my last drink. I'm now going back to my own dorm. Take responsibility for the things that you do. Take responsibility for the things that you don't do. That was the original case for feminism, is that we wanted to be treated as equal human beings. We didn't want favoritism. We didn't want a special treatment. We just want to be equal.
Yeah.
And when I use my race, my skin color, I don't want to be treated differently. I just wanted to be treated as equal before the law, equal in our norms and written and unwritten rules, not to get an opportunity to persecute the other side, because in history we persecuted one group or the other.
Right. Yes. I, like you, I'm worried about.
Revenge.
Oh, sorry.
But
Oh, we just had a little.
it's not about vengeance, it's about moving forward.
Yeah. 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 I was just going to comment on the issue of the Black Lives Matter movement and all that. Again, starts off with good intentions. I think hijacked by the far left with political motives. I wrote this book, The Moral Arc, inspired by Dr. King's, content of our character, not the color of our skin. But we seem to be more obsessed than ever with skin color. And I remember when Jennifer first moved here from Germany, she was like, this is all you guys talk about in America is race, race, race every night on the news. It's like, I mean, come on. Not to mention Hitler and the Nazis on every History Channel documentary you've ever seen. It's like, what is with you Americans? Hitler and race.
I know. Americans are obsessed with race. And for a long time, I avoided the subject because I thought it was just a crazy American trait. They love it. They love talking about race. And then it got to a place where it wasn't a joke anymore.
Yeah.
Some of my colleagues are losing their jobs, their livelihoods. People are being ostracized. And I know they're innocent and I know they're good people, and that should not happen. And so I think then you have to find yourself in a position where you say, this is actually, it may be amusing for some people on social media to pile up on people they don't like and get them out of jobs. They think that's amusing. I think it's not amusing. It's morbid. But if we carry on with this, with indulging Black Lives Matter, indulging Antifa, indulging QAnon, indulging all of these fringe groups, because we think we can mobilize the vote, we're getting ourselves into big, bad trouble, because we're not looking at what's going on in universities. It's now gone down to K-12. We're not actually concerned enough to say this is how our adversaries can exploit this stuff. So all that China has to do is keep pounding on us that we are racist.
Yeah.
They're committing the genocide. We are racist. Get it?
Right.
So I think we should somehow we need to get ourselves out of this fix.
Well, one way to do it would be to quit talking about race, but we seem to be moving in the opposite direction. Well, that's what, look at the New York Times bestseller list. Half the books on there are about race. And I read them just to see what's going on in that genre. And it's just, each author is like, I want to be identified as the black this or the black that. Like, that's the most important thing I can know about you is the amount of melanin you have in your skin. And I'm more inspired by, like my friend Neil deGrasse Tyson, he doesn't want to be the black astrophysicist. He just wants to be an astrophysicist, full stop. And he tells me that, black groups come to him and say, oh, we want to give you this award because you're this black guy. And he goes, I don't want those awards. I'm an astrophysicist. Stop calling me the black astrophysicist.
Yeah.
How could we get to that point?
Yeah. Well, how did we get there is one story that I think my friends Jim Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, Helen Pluckrose, they have done a fantastic job. The book is called Cynical Theories. It's a fantastic job of telling you the story of how we got there. Who are the thinkers and philosophers behind this? They've really done a comprehensive story of, to answer the question, how did we get there? But what I see is this, it's the scam of the year, right? It's the scam of our times. You get someone like Robin DiAngelo, she tells you, Michael, that you are a racist. Are you kidding me? I'm not that. And she says, wow, you're in denial. And if you want to become conscious of the racism that you're unconscious of, you have to pay a sum of money to go and take her courses and so on. And there's this guy, Ibram X. Kendi, who's also in on the scam. And so it's proving to be lucrative. These people say that they're anti-capitalist, anti-American, anti-Western civilization, but they're cashing in.
Yeah.
And so I think of it as, what Bernie Madoff did for the financial crisis and in 2008 and scamming those poor, innocent, gullible people who trusted in him. This is what DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi are doing. You are a good person. You come from a great place. You just want you want to know how you can challenge inequality, how you can end racism. They exploit that compassion.
Yeah.
They think you're gullible.
Right.
And organizations, corporations, governments, agencies are paying them all of this money to come and tell you that you're wearing the most brilliant, beautiful, golden threaded clothes. And one day you'll stand in front of that mirror and say, I've got nothing on. And that's what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. One thing I've invited them all to come on the podcast. I don't think any of them are going to come. Because one question I would ask at the beginning is, if we're living in such a racially oppressive society, how is it that you're at the top of the New York Times bestseller list and you work for a major university and you have all this? How did that happen? Because I know lots of blacks who've been successful. And how did that happen?
Why cash the check if you are anti-capitalist?
Well, there's that too, yes.
Why do it?
Yeah.
Why take money from these racists, right?
Yeah.
Why take money from the racists?
Right. Well, yes.
It's just, in Africa, we just call it witch.
It is like a witchcraft thing, It's like, again, as you said, if I deny being a racist, that's evidence that I'm a racist, because denial is, it's like the witch's mark. Aha! Ayaan, let's wind down by talking about solutions, because that's the important part of your book, I think. Is so there's the ideal world and there's the practical world. What's wrong with the immigration policy that we're going to let X percentage of people in? You got to sign the guest book, and here's the rules for our country. If you don't follow them, you're out. That seems simple enough, but it seems almost impossible to put into practice. So what's the problem with integrating and assimilating people from non-Western countries and Western countries that you see as the problem, and what we can do about it?
So I think there's nothing, obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. But the thing is it, again, to go back to what is versus what should be? Over many years, I think what has happened is we've allowed a number of people to violate that rule and to come in and then be rewarded. And that creates all sorts of problems because there are people who will say, wait a second, why are you giving that person a green card or citizenship when you made me wait in line for all these years? And so you do have to answer that question. But there are also other unintended consequences where you have poor neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, where people are saying, I'm working 2 or 3 jobs to give my kid an education. And now you have a large group of kids coming in who don't speak English. And this affects my kid in negative ways. It doesn't affect you. Are for open borders, but you send your kid to a private school. It's
Right.
all white.
Right.
It's and so my kid is going to this school, to these classrooms of 30, 40 kids, one teacher, so on. So why are you doing that to me? Same thing with healthcare and other limited resources. So there are all sorts of problems that we are not discussing openly. We discuss them in our living rooms. We discuss them in sort of Chatham House rules conference type of things where people come out and say, okay, this is what I think, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I believe. But you know what? I can't really publish a paper on that because that would cost me my career. It's blasphemous. And so that development is really, really, really bad. Now, I do, and this is not to change the subject, but I really do want to talk to you about when, say, you are a European and you want to talk about immigration, and you're an American and you want to talk about immigration, and Americans say, we're an immigrant country, that's why we're so successful. But you only hear half the story, you don't hear the whole story. And the whole story is when America started to allow large numbers of deprived Europeans to come and make their way to America, they didn't let in everyone. The selection was brutal. The vetting was brutal. If you had any kind of disease, if you weren't going to have labor, if you didn't have family that was going to vouch for you, if you were going to be on the dole, you were put back on that ship that brought you in.
Mm-hmm.
And the ships that brought you in knew, the people who were trying to make money out of that, they knew not to bring, or at least to bring less and less people who were going to be sent back because that was done on their dime. And
Right.
so why was America an incredibly successful story of heterogeneity and immigration? It's because they were selective, brutally selective.
Mm.
And now what we're seeing in Europe is that selection is it's deemed immoral, wrong. It's likened to Nazism
Mm-hmm.
and the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the conversation we are not having
Yeah.
about immigration. And you said I know your book is coming up, full-throated support of free inquiry, free conversations, free, talking about these things. But that is the case. It's not, they only the Americans let in the strongest.
Yeah.
It was Darwinian.
Yeah.
So think about that.
Mm-hmm. And also the values that most of the immigrants inculcated, even if they stayed balkanized a little bit in, say, Irish American communities or Chinatowns or German communities, they still mostly inculcated the American values or Western values, let's say Enlightenment values that we talked about. If you got a call this week from the Biden administration or Angela Merkel's administration and said, we want to hire you, Ayaan, tell us, what are the 6 things we should do tomorrow to fix our immigration problem? What would you say?
Well, Angela Merkel, Angela Merkel is on her way out, so that would be a farewell party.
Oh, that's right.
Incoming Biden, incoming Biden administration would be to say, you move away from woke. It doesn't even have to be 6 points. It has to be point number one. You have a majority, but it's the thinnest, perhaps in American history, one of the thinnest.
Yeah.
My husband was trying to tell me about how incredibly thin it is. I would say, so that would be number one. Number two, don't forget the factors that led to Donald Trump's election. It wasn't just because Hillary Clinton wasn't a viable candidate. There were really some structural issues going on there that had to do with immigration, with globalization, with a lot of these things that wokeism brings with them. And if in any way, shape, or form Donald Trump had been just a touch more polite, just a touch more presidential, he would have swept into a second term. Because his policies, not all of them, but many of them were very successful and appealing to the electorate. It's just his personality that put people off. Number three, and it probably should not be number three, it should be number one, is our relationship with China and how we handle that. Obviously, that is on everyone's mind. And you don't talk to me about China, talk to people who know about China. They'll let you know, but I know that is now sort of a priority number one. I would say build on some of the successes. I spent years and years trying to think about and figure out how we deal with Islam, the Middle East, all those issues. The fact that Israel now has a relationship with the UAE, with Bahrain, that I think is a breakthrough. And I think that, bringing Saudi Arabia on board would be just great. If you can accomplish that in the next 2 or 4 years, go for it. In terms of immigration, I would say do not stop building the wall or whatever type of effective border control you can accomplish in exchange for amnesty. Legalizing the kids who were born and raised here, but you have to give the other side something. And the other side wants some kind of firm end note on border regulation. And then we go back into the big picture about immigration, legal versus illegal, who do we allow in, who don't we allow in. But what's also related, and that's my final point, is what do we do about our neighboring countries that are frail states or failing states? What do we do in terms of our foreign policy? What do we do about the Honduras, about Guatemala, about El Salvador, Bolivia, even Mexico? Some of these neighbors are just, I wish we could, think through why we want our neighborhood to be safe, productive, why we want them to be good neighbors, and what can we invest in those countries so that we have a win-win situation instead of what we now have, which is lose-lose.
Yeah. Ayaan, you were a politician in Holland. Would you ever run for political office in America? If you lost your mind, if you completely lost your mind, would you run for?
Yeah, exactly.
I have to say, I don't know why anybody would want to run for president. Half the country hates your guts, and half your party hates you, and the money isn't even that good.
Hates you, yeah. Well, I can reassure myself, and I can reassure all Americans that I can never run for president.
That's right.
Because I'm not a citizen.
Right.
I am a citizen, but I wasn't born in the United States.
Right.
I'm now getting interested in things like school boards and things like that. But I would say, and I do that because all politics is local.
Yes, that's right.
So it's really what affects you directly. And I don't see any reason to run for politics because I see some very good people and real talent doing that.
Yeah.
And I would rather support those people than run for office myself. And I think of myself as being more effective what I do now
You are
than
effective.
have to be subjected to the cheap swims.
That's right. No, you're super effective. I love your books, and of course I traffic in ideas as well. I think that's where the action is ultimately. So to that end, let me just kind of wrap up asking you, why don't feminists like you, or why don't they consider you a fellow feminist? In this context, my podcast this week is with David Sloan Wilson, because he wrote a book called Atlas Hugged. It's a critique of Atlas Shrugged. Anyway, so we got to talking about Ayn Rand, and liberals hate Ayn Rand. And my question is, why? I mean, she's a woman, an immigrant from an oppressed minority, Jewish in Russia. She's pro-choice. She was anti-racist. She was against the Vietnam War. She was, pretty much ticked most of the boxes that liberals would tick. And yet they completely disown her because of her, I guess, economic policies or her emphasis on individualism or pro-capitalism or something like that. It's almost like everything gets erased. Of all the boxes we tick together, they all get erased if you're not on board with this one thing right here. And that seems to be the case with you.
Yeah, and I'm not the only one. Again, is my friend, one of my best friends, Christina Hoff-Sommers, Camille Paglia, you mentioned Heather McDonald. There are a lot of feminists who are confident that as women, we want to be treated as individual human beings, equal before the law, not the same, equal before the law. And actually, we as feminists, we do appreciate our differences. I appreciate the fact that you're different as a man, your outlook, your energy, all sorts of things are different. But I think the feminists who are setting the tone, who probably have been setting the tone since end 60s, 70s, they're feminists who see themselves in some kind of dead-end competition with men. You men, you oppressed us for all of these centuries. Now it's our turn. That's not appealing to me. I don't think in terms of toxic masculinity. I don't think everything about patriarchal society is bad. I think in many ways it's actually been good. So they then have gone woke. They think in terms of intersectionality, levels of victimhood. They think that things come to them or should come to girls and women, not because they work for them, but paradoxically, when women's rights and women's freedom, dignity, when all of that is under strain or when it is threatened, they're not in the room. I mean, Biden just passed, that executive order where you were born as a male, you transitioned into female, but you're going to compete with females. They're not saying anything about that.
Yeah.
Maybe they even endorse it. Abigail Schreier wrote that amazing book. You should have her on your podcast, where she writes, it opened my eyes. There's this craze where young girls are not feeling good in their own bodies, and they think that they want to transition. They're being encouraged by all kinds of bad actors on social media. And the medical community, the education community, the political community, they're all facilitating this. But there are a lot of young women who are saying, this is not what I wanted.
Yeah.
But they've been mutilated already, lost their breasts. They've been put into hormonal programs, all sorts of bad things. These feminists are not saying anything about that. The same feminists who never said anything about female genital mutilation, honor killings, honor violence. And so then you have to ask yourself, what is the quality of their feminism?
Right.
It's not feminism at all. It's
Right.
just narcissism.
Right.
So I'm very critical of them. They're critical of me. that's a fine place to be.
Yes. Ayaan, I'm going to read the final paragraphs of your book, which I really loved. The pendulum is swinging back toward misogyny as liberal Europe changes to accommodate migrant cultures. Adaptation is happening, but it's happening the other way around. Progress is not only not inevitable, in this case, it is reversing. In writing this book, I have come to the conclusion that we need a new women's movement, one that views the world not in terms of multiculturalism and intersectionality, but in universal terms, and that, in the spirit of John Stuart and Harriet Taylor Mill, is prepared to stand up for the rights of all women. Women's safety from predatory men is the issue around which all true feminists must rally and coalesce. We women can and must refuse to be relegated, as we have been in the past, as I have been in my own lifetime, to the status of prey. I hope you will join me in this endeavor. How can listeners access your institute? What's the URL people could go to support your movement?
Just go to the website, theahafoundation.com.
AAH.com.
THEAHA Foundation.
Well,
.com.
Perfect. We'll include a link with this. Ayaan, yeah, we'll put a link down below the podcast audio and video links. Ayaan, thanks for taking the time. I know you have other interviews lined up. You're starting your book tour here. We'll release this on the day the book comes out. And, I just want to thank you for your work. I just think you're one of the great champions of our time.